discuss the many benefits, risks and regulations of fracking is Dr. Michael Dorsey from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. We also have a leading authority on fracking from Pennsylvania, Dr. Terry Engel there. He is a geoscience professor at Penn State University and was instrumental in revolutionizing fracking in the United States. And joining me in the studio as well is energy expert and consultant Katie Brown. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start with Dr. Engel there in Pennsylvania. You are a strong supporter of fracking. We've just heard that it poses dangers to the environment, it causes pollution. Why is it such a good idea?
Well, as you know, the human economy is like any natural system, and that natural systems in general thrive in proportion to the energy, the inexpensive, easily obtainable energy that they have access to. And while there are risks associated with fracking, and while it can't be completely safe, the benefits, and these are the economic benefits, certainly speak worlds in terms of what it has done globally in terms of political realignments, and it has had a large impact certainly on the United States in its energy portfolio.
Michael, as we heard there are risks in this method of drilling, but do the economic benefits of fracking outweigh environmental concerns?
You know, absolutely not. The reality is that the economic benefits are really essentially being privatized for a small group of firms that are driving fracking forward, mainly in the oil and gas sector, while the harms that fall on largely those on the margins, particularly young people, children especially, mothers, pregnant mothers in particular, those harms are actually socialized across society. And that's precisely why Governor Cuomo in New York moved to ban fracking completely, because he recognized that the burden was falling disproportionately on those on the margins of society. And the economic benefits in terms of the handful of jobs that the industry is generating just weren't there for a big state like New York. So you've got places like New York leading the way in calling a foul and calling a bad idea on this overall project. And it's something that we need to move away from. So we had a nice baby step from the feds by banning this on public lands, but we need that really big step to get out of this altogether, because it's essentially a cul-de-sac for the environment, it's a cul-de-sac for public health, and for the health of those on the margins, children and mothers, pregnant mothers especially.
Katie, we have a number of states where fracking takes place that have introduced their own regulations on how this drilling should be carried out. We now have, as we just reported, the federal government which published its rules. What are these rules? Do they go far enough?
Well, the important thing to know about these rules is that the states have been effectively regulating hydraulic fracturing for over 65 years now. And the benefit of that is that states understand their own geologies, they understand their own environments far better than the federal government, and they have a clear record of safety for the over 65 years. What the federal government regulations will do is put a one-size-fits-all mandate on fracking in all federal lands, and that puts another layer of red tape on these federal lands, and that will disincentivize production there.
So you're saying then that the main industry lobbying group has a point when it says that the federal government is, as they put it, addressing unsubstantiated concerns?
Well, that's right. They're certainly not necessary when you see a 65-year record of safe development, and you don't have to take my word for it either. You can listen to EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy, who said that there's nothing inherently dangerous about fracking that sound engineering practices can accomplish. Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz has said that the risks of fracking are manageable, and they certainly have been under state regulations.
Right. Dr. Engel, I just want to get into some of the details of the pollution that takes place. There is a professor like yourself in Pennsylvania called Dan Volz. He says that the water that is pumped in to force this gas up, that water, of course, has to come back to the surface as well. But when it does come back, it is highly contaminated. He accepts that it is filtered, but it is still highly polluted when it is put back into the river.
Well, one of the things that industry is moving towards is a system that's called a closed loop system that involves recycling of this water to use in each succeeding fracture. The other thing that has happened is that the state of Pennsylvania no longer permits this water to be released in streams. It has to be treated, and some of the treatment involves, for example, evaporation of the water and capturing of the salts. And so as the industry has evolved, it has certainly become safer and safer. Now, again, I can't overemphasize the fact that this is not a completely safe system. It never will be, like most human activities, but the industry is moving in a very positive direction.
Michael, can we trust the energy industry to regulate itself to make sure that there's no contaminants, no pollution put back into the system?
Well, the track record isn't that great. I mean, you know, I think Dr. Englander is right when he says that there have been consistent and serial regulations that have been clamping down on bad behavior by coming up with these so-called closed-loop systems. The whole point of ratcheting up these regulations is that increasingly regulators, and not just regulators, but state governments in a variety of states, are recognizing the inherent dangers of this process. So the real question is not, can we trust these folks, is why should we be playing a kind of a casino game with livelihoods, particularly children, young mothers? Why should we even expose people to these things when we really don't have to? I mean, 65 years ago, that's one thing. That's way back in the 20th century, Anand. We're in the 21st century. The 21st century is not about oil and gas. It's about green, clean energy that's responsible for protecting the environment, delivering big returns on the economy. Let's deliver that 21st century energy.
Right, okay, let me ask you this, Michael. The filtering process that takes place, does it cost, or does it push the production cost of the gas and oil that comes from this procedure?
Well, I mean, I think some industry might claim it does, you know, impact their production costs. But the real point is that does it clean up the wastewater sufficiently to protect those that are being exposed? And how long are we going to do essentially a large experiment on communities that are exposed to this waste to see if they are harmed? You know, are we going to do a 10-year period or 20-year period to track the exposures to this? And we don't need to do that in the first place. We don't need to prop up this faulty type of energy production. We need to really begin to move out of this altogether. We need to keep gas in the land, as some of my colleagues say, oil in the soil, and that involves paving out the future of green technology, which just isn't.
Katie, can we trust, you know, the same question I put to Mike, can we trust the production, these energy companies to regulate themselves? Because they want to maximize profits. It's going to cost them more to go through all these processes to make sure that there's no pollution put back into the earth.
Oh, well, they're absolutely not regulating themselves. They're regulated by the states. They're regulated under...
No, they say they want to regulate themselves, that they don't need regulation.
No, they're regulated by the states and the federal lands right now. When these regulations come in, it would be regulated by the federal government. So there's certainly plenty of regulation. They are subject to the Clean Water Act. They're subject to the Clean Air Act. Under federal regulations, there's multiple layers of regulations involved, and there's a clear record of safety there.
And the other point that we should mention is that these rules and regulations apply only to federal and Native American lands.
Right.
But most of the fracking is taking place on private lands.
lands.
What do we know about what's going on those properties?
It's being done safely, and again, that's what Obama's top regulators are saying. That's what governors across the country are saying. Governor Jerry Brown, who is a staunch environmentalist, who says climate change is his #1 priority, he says that anti-fracking activists don't know what they're talking about. You look at other governors, former Governor Martin O'Malley, Governor Hickenlooper of Colorado, all of these Democratic governors who are environmentalists have looked at the science, and they've said fracking is safe, and we want it in our states.
Fracking is safe, Michael, and anti-fracking activists don't know what they're talking about.
Well, if Governor Cuomo of New York is an anti-fracking activist, then I side with him. I think the reality is that those that are looking out for their constituencies and are looking out for the future of this country are putting their bets on a renewable future. They're also putting real serious tight regulations on these companies, particularly on government lands. But the fact is, I sit on the EPA's National Advisory Committee, and the reality is that even though there is a mandate for regulatory oversight and regulators getting into this mix, there is limited capacity at the federal level to do the kind of regulation in a comprehensive manner. So we're challenged even there, but also when you know the numbers, roughly about 15 to 20% of fracking is happening on federal lands. The vast majority is taking place outside of that. So that commitment from the feds is an important baby step, like I said at the outset, but much, much more needs to be done, not just to regulate this and to oversee it, but to get out of it altogether.